Rarely ever in world history do we see good ideas remain bottled up. What I mean by this is that, if somebody comes up with some new groundbreaking thought process or a new invention that will improve people's lives, it's really hard for them to keep that as a secret. We see all the time where new inventions get launched, and it seems like almost immediately those inventions are then copied by somebody else. And with the copying, you oftentimes get some level of improvement, right? I mean, trends have always operated in this manner. Something becomes cool, it catches on, and before you know it, everybody's doing it. From a technology standpoint, probably the best example I think about is something like, cell phone technology. When I was in high school, rarely anybody had access to something like a cell phone, and maybe only the richest of the rich had something like a beeper. If you've never seen a beeper before, go Google it. Well, by the time I get to college, all of a sudden cell phones start to become more normal, and you get more and more companies that start producing them. And then before you know it, the price comes down and some more people buy them. And then with that, the technology associated with cell phones gets more advanced. They start to take pictures, they start to text message. And here we are now, a mere 19 years later, and you could be watching this web broadcast of this lesson on your phone. That good idea of a cell phone did not remain bottled up. This isn't something that we just see with technologies. Whole trends of eras, the way that people behave, can oftentimes rub off on their neighbors, either directly or indirectly. They could either be copied on purpose or sometimes copied more subtly, without even realizing that you are acculturating or adopting something that somebody else has introduced. In today's lesson, we're going to look at how the great ideas and techniques of the Renaissance era also don't remain bottled up in their petri dish. We highlighted in past lessons how the Renaissance emerges in northern Italy during the late 1300s and early 1400s, this rebirth of knowledge and this emphasis all of a sudden on artistic talent and innovation. Well, what we see is that by the 1450s, these trends start to spread to the north and the west. Basically, phase two of what we would call the Renaissance, or what is commonly referred to by historians today as the Northern Renaissance, a reference to the fact that these other kind of hearths of learning pop up in places like northern France, parts of northern Germany, a region known as Flanders, what is now today the Low Countries of the Netherlands, Belgium, and Luxembourg, as well as even places as far away as southern England. The same progress, slowly but surely, gets acculturated and adopted by these societies as well. Now, just like we talked about the fact that the Renaissance itself was launched in part because of a combination of complex factors all coming together, so too do we see the growth of these Renaissance ideas outside of the bounds of northern Italy, also a result of numerous factors at play. Oftentimes, historians cite that one of the largest contributing factors to all this was the end of one of the most prolonged conflicts in all of European history, a conflict called the 100 Years' War, which had raged in France between the countries of France and England for something like 114 years. It was this kind of dynastic squabble between the ruling families and who owned what feudal lands. Well, by the mid-1400s, 1453 specifically, the 100-Year War ends, and the English armies are driven out by the French once and for all. Well, why this is so important is that, for 100 years, France was a war zone. This crossroads of Europe, between north and south, was a war zone. which made travel and trade very precarious. So if you were, a wealthy merchant, you weren't going through France if you didn't have to. You were taking, routes around. You were maybe swinging to the east. You weren't going to places like England or the Low Countries. And so it really stifled international trade and economic development. It kind of, again, prolonged that economic and social funk. Well, what we see happen after this 100 Years' War ends is all of a sudden the traditional trade between Northern and Southern Europe really starts to boom. And primarily the big money-making industry in Northern Europe, especially these areas that became the center of the Northern Renaissance movement, was traditionally the wool trade. You think about Great Britain topographically, the British Isles. These are fairly hilly, kind of green, lush island environments. They get a lot of rain and storms that roll off of the North Sea and the North Atlantic. They have fairly temperate climates, in part because of the existence of the Gulf Stream, bringing those kind of warm Caribbean waters across the ocean as well. But in addition to that, they have lots of hills that are not necessarily overly good for large-scale agriculture. So historically, English and Welsh and Scottish farmers, as far back as anybody can remember, raised a significant number of sheep. Hey, I'm just going to turn these sheep loose on that hillside and they're going to eat pretty much anything. And then, once a year, I'm going to bring them in maybe in the spring and I'm going to shear all that wool. What was very common during, parts of the Middle Ages, especially, during the 10 and 11 and 1200s before the 100 Years' War began, was that many towns and villages in England would hold what were called fleece fairs. These big, once a year markets where people would come from all around and they would bring all their wool in these massive sacks and they would auction it off to the highest bidder. And oftentimes the people that bought the wool at these fleece fairs were oftentimes Italian merchants. Because remember, the Italians, they were the ones engaged in international trade before everybody else, right? That's where we see the growth of these earliest cities in Europe. This is where we see the emergence of the middle class. They had money to spend. So a lot of times you get, Italians that would travel north and they go around to all these fleece fairs buying it up to then transport it back to Italy, to then be refined into cloth, to be made into clothing, and then sold for enormous profit. Clothing was super expensive at a time when everything was basically handmade. It was a massive booming industry. Where the region of Flanders comes into play, and no, I don't mean this Flanders. Okay, again, I'm referring to kind of this area here, parts of northern France, parts of modern day Germany, Netherlands, etc. So this historically was called Flanders. How they get in the action and why they become so prosperous is that at some point, the Italians realize that, well, it's instead of us going all the way up here and then coming all the way back with the wool, why don't we just use some of these merchants from some of these towns to act as middlemen? They travel north, they putz around in England, and then, they ship the stuff back south to us, saves us a lot of trouble. Again, my point of bringing all this up is that, end of the 100 Years' War happens, and all of a sudden you get this resumption of this natural regional trade that had existed for hundreds of years. And you get the same domino effect then that kind of falls into place that had happened in northern Italy. Growth of cities, merchant middle class booming, people with disposable income, money to spend. And what are they going to spend it on? They're going to reinvest it in new business ventures, but they're also going to use it on luxury goods. They're going to use it to show off. And again, what we see is that this kind of fad, this trend of artwork and appreciating artwork catches on pretty much anywhere that the Italians go or where Italian business goes. One of the most famous examples is in France. You had a king of France. His name was Francis I, guy pictured up here, who at the time of the Northern Renaissance, again mid 1400s, became infatuated with Italian paintings, to the point where he was basically buying it up as much as he could purchase. Anytime that merchants would come in from the south, he'd say, hey, next time you come through, bring a bunch of paintings by Caravaggio, or bring a bunch of paintings by this painter, bring a bunch of, I've been looking for a good Donatello. Please see if you can purchase one by him and ship it up to me. If you've ever heard of the Louvre before in Paris, it used to be at one point the royal palace of the royal family, way back when. Nowadays, the Louvre is one of like the most impressive art collections in the world. Okay, it's the museum that houses the Mona Lisa. And if you've ever wondered, well, why the heck is there like all these Italian paintings in a French museum? That's why. Became popular with the king. They had the connection of trade with Italy. Since the king was really into it, the nobility starts to kind of mimic him. And next thing you know, it becomes a trend. And everybody wants some of this like Renaissance style Italian artwork. Again, that stuff kind of happens all the time in the world around us today. Now, as this becomes a trend, again, the next logical step is that people in France or people in Flanders or people in England or people in Germany are going to start to say, well, how can I cash in on this myself? Right? Like if all these people want, fancy paintings from Italy, what if I learn how to do these fancy paintings and I sell them myself, like cut out the middleman and, I'll make big profit. Again, we know people are motivated by the desire to make money. So it's one of our historic themes, right? Our universal truths. So what starts to happen then, the logical next step, is you got these markets home. You got all these wealthy merchants and nobles that, hey, we want to buy artwork, but not many domestic artists. And so in many of those regions, people that are aspiring artists themselves say, you know what? I'm going to travel to Italy. I'm going to go, get a job studying as an apprentice under one of these Renaissance masters themselves. And so you had people from all over Europe that were pouring into northern Italy, were working in these workshops, again, like we talked about the other day, maybe doing the brush strokes of the background or shaping out the initial form of a statue as part of this like assembly line of production. Like this is an artist depiction from the era of one of these Renaissance workshops. You see lots and lots of people doing stuff at the same time. And these guys would serve their apprenticeships, maybe 7 years, maybe 10 years, maybe 14 years. And when they were done, when they were then considered a master in their own right, they would then take those skills and that knowledge and go back to their home country and cash in and set up their own workshop. So it's this direct, again, acculturation and transplanting of a lot of that knowledge and techniques firsthand. Another thing that we see that happens that directly spreads Renaissance thought and artwork is what are called the Italian Wars. So we got one war that ends, in the mid-1500s, and we get another set of wars that begins in the 1490s. I mean, that right there is the story of European history for you. War after war after war after war somewhere, constantly fought over. Well, you have in the 1490s the beginning of a series of wars that are just generally referred to as the Italian Wars. They last well into the 1550s, and basically what the Italian Wars were was they were a series of kind of regional conflicts in all of Italy between the armies of France and Spain. They didn't fight as much along their shared border. Instead, they fought for political dominance of Italy because Italy was where the money was. And both countries wanted to keep the other rival country from getting their hands on, some of these profit-producing areas. So northern Italy, for a solid 60 years, so the heart of the Renaissance movement, where it all begins, becomes a war zone. And what then happens is many of these, great thinkers and artists look around and they say, I'm not staying here. I'm not going to sit here in Florence when Florence, has a siege placed on it and, we run out of food and disease is rampant. I'm not going to sit here and, in Siena when Siena is having cannonballs launched at its wall. Like, no, I'm getting the heck out of Dodge. I'm going somewhere to safety. And again, this is not all that dissimilar from what I talked about the other day, with the Byzantines at the time of the collapse of the Byzantine Empire, which again is roughly, 100 years prior to this, where you get the collapse of the Byzantine Empire and people see it. It's a prolonged collapse. Little by little, they're losing territory. You got the Ottomans at the gates of Constantinople. And one of the things that we see time and time again in world history, it's not always the case, but it oftentimes is a trend that we can at least identify, is that when stuff gets really bad, oftentimes it's your best and your brightest, right? Your people that are highly trained or highly skilled, or people that have knowledge or have educations, and by extension oftentimes have money and resources, that often are the people that kind of look around and they say, whoa, I need to get out of here. I need to buy a one-way plane ticket out of this place. We saw it, again, stuff like, Albert Einstein leaving Germany, Enrico Fermi leaving Italy, two great Manhattan Project scientists. They looked around, they saw the rise of these fascist regimes, and they said, I don't think I want to stay here. And they went somewhere else. Same thing happens with Italy. Leonardo da Vinci, for example, this great Renaissance man, ends up spending a huge amount of the latter part of his life living with Francis I as a guest, basically as a refugee in France. He doesn't live in Florence. He grows up, spends a lot of his life in Florence, but spends the tail end of his life in another country altogether. Brings his whole entourage, all of his workshop staff to France. You get that physical transplanting because of these conflicts. Now, that said, while all these other things are hugely important, again, you got to have all this happen, you got to have the money, right? You got to have the money, you got to have the skills, you got to have the knowledge, all that. By far, though, the most important factor, and probably one of the most important developments in all of human history, is in 1452, you get the invention of the modern printing press by Johann Gutenberg, a merchant and craftsman who was living in Mainz, Germany. And if you don't know where that is, it's kind of located in the Rhine River region, Western Germany. Invention of the modern printing press. I remember back in 2000, year 2000, the TV station A&E put together this like multi-part, series. It was like 4 1-hour-long episodes where they ranked the 100 most important people of the past millennia. So 100 most powerful, influential people that changed the world over the past 1,000 years. And who was number one on that list? More important than religious leaders, more important than kings and queens. It was this guy, a random merchant from a town in Western Germany. Now, the story of Gutenberg is actually kind of interesting, but it's also very reflective, of the era, in the sense that he's a guy who we have a lot of holes in his story. We don't know a ton about him. And again, it makes sense why we don't know a ton about him. It's like he was a regular dude. Well, I mean, he was wealthy by the standards of the time, but at the end of the day, he was just kind of an average everyday guy, average everyday merchant. So it's not like he had some person following him around, documenting his life. It's not like he was writing down every little last thing that he ever did in order to be preserved for posterity. He was just a merchant trying to get by, make some money. So he's a guy who kind of, in his life, kind of appears and disappears constantly in the historic record. We have these big gaps in the story, if you will, of his life. What we do know about him, or can kind of theorize about him, it's believed that he was born like in the 1390s. 1398 is probably the most commonly cited date. Most people believe that he was a son of a cloth merchant, so again, involved in the North-South wool trade. But again, even that's somewhat disputed. His prime vocation was that he was a goldsmith. So again, he would have entered into a guild, and he would have had to serve as an apprentice, then became a journeyman, and been approved by the guild as a master to even be involved in that mercantile endeavor in the first place. Other than that, some people theorize he had different kind of shops and did other things too, but that goldsmithing was like his main profession. Some other things that we know about him is that it's believed that he actually left Mainz, Germany for political reasons at one time. Like his dad was probably involved in some level of city government. A lot of cities within what is now Germany kind of independently governed themselves and had elected governments of merchants. And it's believed that maybe he was kind of forced out, and then his dad was kind of forced out, and so he left for a while. It's actually believed that, when he developed the printing press, that he wasn't even living in his hometown, that he was actually living in another large city, again, kind of in self-imposed exile, a city called Strasbourg, another large city, and that he then later moved back to Mainz in 1450 to try to set up, a printing shop, to try to monetize his invention. Other things that we know about him that show up in the historic record is that we do know that in order to set up his shop in the first place and to kind of maybe build his first truly functional large printing press, that he took out a loan from another merchant in Mainz by the name of John Faust. Okay, and that John Faust loaned him something like 800 guilders, which was a unit of currency then. And that, like any other loan, he had fixed payments that he had to make with interest, and he was expected to pay it back, over time. Well, here, he comes up with this great idea. This is going to change everything. I can print quickly. I can copy books quickly and accurately. But the thing was that the thing about Gutenberg that he never figured out was how to make profit off of this. Sometimes it takes a little bit for the demand to catch up, with the breakthrough. I always think about this with things, like something like a TV. I remember when the first time I ever saw a flat screen TV, it was so cost prohibitive to buy a flat screen TV that nobody bought them. They were for sale, but they were like thousands and thousands of dollars, and nobody bought them. It took a while for kind of the demand to align with, the technology. And then the price came down. Well, in the case with this, he decides, okay, well, I need to print some stuff quick. I need to produce some books here quick, and so I can make some profit off of this, so I can pay back this loan, so I'm not in debt. And so he thinks about it, and he's like, okay, well, what is like, something that people buy that's a book? Aha! Bibles. And so the very first thing that he ever printed on the printing press was 180 copies of the Bible, what today is now known as the Gutenberg Bible. And half of these, he printed on vellum, this traditional stretched animal skin, and some were printed on like newer paper technology. So there was kind of a mix there. They were all printed in Latin, and he figured, okay, these will sell out like crazy. And it was a complete and total flop. It was a flop in part because, the price still was very, very high. It was something like 30 florins, which was another unit of currency. It was an Italian unit of currency, which was like equivalent of like 3 years worth of wages for an educated, person. 3 years. So nobody was going to fork that out. And as a result, Gutenberg could not pay back his loan. Faust ends up bringing him to court over this. You end up getting things like compound interest on the original loan. And by 1456, where again it shows up in the historic record, the court records show that Gutenberg by this point now owed him basically the equivalent of like $20,000. And he is found guilty of defaulting on this debt. And when they go to the court and he declares bankruptcy, basically the court says to Faust, okay, you can take Gutenberg's invention. You can take his shop, you can take his printing press. And from that point then, we know that Gutenberg just kind of like disappears. We don't know really what he did for a while. He left Mainz at one point in the 1460s, but then by the late 1460s, he returns back to Mainz, but it's kind of recognized as a hero in a way. Because by that point, we're talking about 20 years after his initial invention, the invention starts to catch on. And people start to realize, like, whoa, this is a great idea. This is transformative. We can produce books so much faster than before. And so at the tail end of his life, he was actually recognized for his work and given a small stipend by the local archbishop. And I did some research. I was curious about, like, okay, well, how were stipends paid out at the time? So Gutenberg was given a stipend that he was, as a merchant, allowed to sell. So he wasn't given money, but he was given this. He was allowed to sell up to 2,180 liters of grain and 2,000 liters of wine tax-free. So he could sell as much of that kind of stuff as he wanted without paying a single bit of taxes to religious government, city government, whatsoever. So at least, he had some acknowledgement of his deeds during his lifetime. Now, that said, he ends up dying then in 1468, and his remains were buried in some, church that was later torn down, and now we have no idea where Mr. Gutenberg is. So he kind of died in some level of obscurity for being this, like, most important guy of the past 1,000 years. Now, basically what Gutenberg did in a nutshell, and again, we don't know, like, was he working on this for years and years? Did he have a workshop or a lab? Like, was this his side hobby? Would he tinker on this, every night? Like, we don't know that kind of backlog on this story. All we know is that Gutenberg didn't come up with something 100% unique. Rather, he took a bunch of already existing inventions and he just combined them. So what I mean by this is, like, the base of the Gutenberg printing press was a basic agricultural screw press. This is a screw press. Okay. Traditionally, in what is now Germany, screw presses were primarily used to make cider. I actually built this summer, just as like a side little project. I have apple trees in my backyard, and me and my kids built our own cider press. Now, mine's not a screw press. Instead, I used like a bottle jack for a car. But it acts in the same way. You basically have a bucket or a barrel, and you have slits in the barrel, and then you have this screw that when you turn it on the top up here, it pushes down and applies pressure and torque, which then squeezes all of the juices out of whatever fruit you put in there. So you put cherries in there, you can squeeze the juice out of cherry. You put apples in there, you squeeze juice out of apples. In Southern Europe, traditionally they use these for things like olives. You put a bunch of olives in there, put pressure, use the screw press, and you get olive oil. So he basically took that as his base, okay, and then kind of built like a little extension off of it. And then he combined it with some other stuff that already existed. For example, movable type. I thought I had a picture. Movable type. Movable type, so individual little characters, with the letters engraved on them that you could put in a block, line up, coat with ink, press against your paper. Then you got a new page, reset your type. Movable type had been developed in China like hundreds and hundreds of years prior to this. But why movable type never really caught on and didn't really even catch on in China was that the Chinese language has too many symbols. It was like way unusable in China. So, idea existed, but just kind of floating out there, waiting to be harnessed and applied. Same thing with, stuff like metallurgy. Probably the one thing that was 100% Gutenberg's idea is he did come up with an idea, being a goldsmith, for a metal alloy. And I don't know all the scientific stuff for this, but basically a metal alloy that he was able to smelt to pour into these little dies, stamped with letters that were really easy to mold, very durable, and that seemed to hold ink well. He figures that out. Okay, so I got this metal, I got these movable types, perfect, put them in this block, I got my screw press. He realizes that, hey, if you want to get it to stick to the movable type, it needs to be an oil-based ink. Can't be a water-based ink, gotta be an oil-based ink. That was an important thing in its own right. Oil-based ink was out there, but nobody was really using it in this manner. And then finally, again, paper making techniques. He realized that, hey, this is the direction that things are moving. Paper making had only became common in Europe, or was starting to become common in Europe during the 1300s. And again, it was something that was part of that whole Crusades trade, learned from the Arabs, brought into the European world. So Gutenberg's genius, again, isn't being this guy that comes up with, this totally just new, out there, unique thing. He's the practical application guy. He realizes if I take A plus B plus C plus D, hey, I can make something that is really, really usable. And this right here is just a depiction of what his original workshop would have looked like. So you was seeing just kind of this replica of his first printing press, and then kind of how he had his very small office and workshop set up. Now I said that, okay, so he prints these Bibles. Again, just to give you an idea of how insanely impressive his accomplishment was. So prior to this, it took, your average monk something like 5 months to copy a single book. And that's all day, every day copying of the Bible. One book, 5 months. Gutenberg's new press allowed them to increase the pace of production. Once you got all your movable type and everything set, ready to go, one person could make 500 books in 1 month. So all of a sudden, your supply of books skyrockets, which makes them way cheaper and way more accessible to the common man. So some of the biggest, takeaways from Gutenberg's invention and why this is so important to spreading Renaissance ideas is that literacy skyrockets all over the place. Now, I don't want you to think that this means that you got a bunch of, peasants that are sitting there reading and discussing literature. No. Okay. Literacy rates among the lower classes are going to take a very, very, very long time to increase. But at least in cities, most peoples become highly literate by the 1500s. Why? In part, the accessibility and the cost of printed materials. The other huge takeaway, of course, as I harped on, when we're talking about the Middle Ages, church censorship, right? Any new ideas that maybe the church didn't like or that clash with church teaching, when that monk's sitting down to copy it, they just, nope, don't like that. Throw it in the wastebasket. Snuffs out the idea. Now you can't snuff out the idea. Now, okay, I'm not taking it to the church. I'm going to bring it to this random printer over here who doesn't necessarily have an agenda. I'm going to pay him and he's going to make copies. More so than books, the thing that becomes insanely common during the latter part of the 1400s and early 1500s is pamphlets. Short little essays. Didn't take much time to make. Definitely didn't take very long to copy. And you could easily and cheaply disseminate them. Hey, I got some ideas here. I'm just going to give you the quick and dirty part of it, and I'm going to distribute it all over the place. And those ideas are going to spread like wildfire. That, more than anything else, is what promotes progress. I put here just a link in my PowerPoint. You can check it out if you're interested. There's actually a website out there, cool website out there called Project Gutenberg. And what it is it's a nonprofit organization that is trying to get all of these like older books and things like permanently housed for free on their website. Again, to promote the dissemination of free books and works. And again, it's a reference to basically what he did, hundreds of years ago. So it's from this that we see this, again, explosion of knowledge outward in all directions. And it's also, especially this development of Gutenberg's printing press combined with these Renaissance ideas, that are going to cause tremendous religious change in Europe. And that's going to bring about in 1517 our next topic, the Protestant Reformation. You can't have the Reformation without Gutenberg and the Renaissance happening first. So we'll stop there. That kind of wraps up that lesson. And tomorrow we will leap forward into looking at Martin Luther and the writing of the 95 Theses.